Marian conspiracy is the sixth story in Big Finish's main range, and very much still part of the era when the company was finding itself. Naturally, given this was only half a year in. It also meant that a few things were still being established that's very relevant when considering why I'm looking at this story at all, for which we'll get to. See, with 3 Doctors initially, each of the Doctors would get a story about 4 times a year. Obviously with the 8th Doctor arriving not long afterwards, this would be reduced, but that was the initial idea, it seems pretty obvious. And no doubt as the actors for the companions would have varying levels of flexibility, and as well to ensure a deal of variety across the stories, generally each Doctor seemed to have 2 separate eras that the stories would draw from. For the 5th Doctor in his early years, he tended to have stories either travelling solo with Nyssa, and then stuff from later on in his era, with either Turlough or Perry, depending on Mark Striction's availability. The 7th would usually have stuff from earlier on and later in his personal timeline, which probably makes more sense if you read the VNAs to have a sense of where this all fits. I haven't, so I don't. That both would usually feature Ace, probably simply reflected that Sophie Aldred was a reliably available and enthusiastic performer. But for the 6th Doctor this was more difficult. Obviously he had stuff with Perry, and indeed his first solo story, Whispers of Terror, featured her, but the problem was there was little else from his TV era that could be drawn upon. Bonnie Langford was only available every now and again, and this would have to be shared with the 7th Doctor anyway, so it's not like at the end of the era could be drawn upon for a regular series of audios. So the solution was pretty obvious. Introduce the first audio-only companion. Now you have to realise the importance of this moment, as it was the first time the 6th Doctor was getting a companion who wasn't entirely created at the ridiculous whim of John Nathan Turner. With no respect to Bryant or Langford, both Perry and Mel were not great characters and certainly did not fit the 6th Doctor as a character, the latter better than the former for sure, but what he really needed was someone both willing to push back against his bravado, bullshit, and to be his moral compass, and that just ain't Mel. This meant for the first time they could pair him up with someone who would play to those strengths, plus with a general better writing and somewhat mellowing in the character. I think this is a bit overstated when people talk about the difference between TV and Audio 6, mostly it's just better writing making it seem that way. Went a hell of a way to making the 6th Doctor just as beloved as the rest, despite the rocky run he had on television. I'll cut to the chase that Evelyn Smythe, the companion that resulted from this, is my favourite Big Finish companion and one of my favourite companions of all time. Played beautifully by the late great Maggie Stables, Evelyn fulfills the role I mentioned perfectly. She's sharp, witty, no nonsense, and takes absolutely none of the 6th Doctor's bullshit. The uncomfortable feeling that he was intimidating Perry throughout his TV run is totally absent, as you get the feeling that if anyone is being intimidated by anyone, it's not that way round. But she also has a fierce moral compass and deeply cares about people, in a way that she can push back on the Doctor, who naturally sometimes can be a bit callous. It's the perfect balance, and I think it's entirely possible without this character's success, the introduction of future audio-only companions like Charlie, Aramem or Hex would have been far more difficult. Now, we're here because this is her first story, and I wanted to establish both her and the run of audios this would start. The character being such a success, the 6th Doctor's line essentially became entirely her for a long time, bearing the old one off, which nearly freed up Nicola Bryant to pair up Perry with the 5th Doctor. And overall, it's a really solid run that gives Evelyn herself a satisfying and effective character arc. The reason I'm looking at this is because later on in the arc there's a certain Dalek story that would prove extremely important and influential when it came to relaunching the Daleks in New Who. And having set up the context before I look at that as part of my ongoing look at the Daleks is something I wanted to do, so here we are. Unfortunately, this story is unfortunately where this falls apart a bit for me, because I'm not an enormous fan of it, I have to say, which I know goes against the grain a bit when it comes to the popular opinion, but overall I think it's a bit lackluster, although I'd be hard pressed to call it actually bad, I have to admit. It is, to me at least, just a bit flat, dull and predictable, and to be entirely honest seems happy to do little of what is, to be fair, a promising premise. It does its most important thing right, to introduce Evelyn, to set up her character and her relationship with the Doctor, and I won't diminish the importance of that, it's just kind of everything else it doesn't really set things alight over. This story was Big Finish's first attempt at a pure historical, which I do like, using the fact that this is a different medium with a different audience to revisit this format that was unlikely to work on TV beyond the 60s, and that the only time they did so was Black Orchid should underscore this point. That's the kind of thing I like. It shows they were willing to try new things, and there were some successes when Big Finish did this format throughout the years. But I think this story underscores why it's still one you have to be careful with. I mean, whether the story even counts as one is, I suppose, a question. While there are no sci-fi elements unrelated to the Doctor or Evelyn, all the time technobabble is a major driver of the plot, but I'll say it's close enough for me to count. Anyway, the issue is that without sci-fi elements to drive the story, you need to be bloody careful you make this historical stuff engaging or interesting on its own. Despite how tired the format eventually got, and they were right to ditch it when they did, the track record of getting us right in the 60s was actually pretty good. But then you can argue that spoke to the show's approach at the time, that it being an educational show that was considered more of an adventure series than a sci-fi one. With Doctor Who as it is now, that becomes a bit more of a difficult of a balance to tread, and I think that's where this story's biggest problem comes in. The plot itself is pretty weak, unfortunately. The driving force is the time what's-it technobabble, which is nonsense pulled out of thin air that occasionally returns to provide some peril, but otherwise is simply a plot function and nothing else. And the historical story just doesn't have enough punch to it. Looking at the conflicts of the English Reformation should be interesting, but unfortunately the whole meat of the conflict feels very distant from the events at hand, and the motivations for the characters themselves aren't strong enough to make up for it. Reverend Thomas is a devout Protestant because that's what he is, and it affects him because, well, it doesn't really. He's all suspicious and scheming, and that doesn't really have much to do with his religion. Yeah, it never really comes together. Most of these characters are boring in hell and have characteristics in place of character, which is never a great sign, i.e. they're Protestants, or Reverends, or French. And you have to be very careful with plots like this, because the audience knows that they're doomed. We all know Mary wasn't assassinated by Protestants, so for this plot to be engaging, the journey needs to be interesting, and it's not. The only way you won't guess who Thomas's fellow schemer in Mary's palace is if you've never encountered any other work of fiction before, and the conspiracy itself just doesn't grab attention. This should be gripping, but there's just a distance and malaise to it. It never feels quite as urgent as it should. The character actions also don't quite work. The Doctor and Evelyn, for instance, in the finale basically go, "Oh, so you're the one who tried to murder the Queen!" right in front of the Queen, and then pat themselves on the back for talking the Queen out of executing said person, when if they kept their mouth shut, it's unlikely she'd even have found out in the first place. And to be frank, early on it's difficult to keep track of who suspects Evelyn of being a spy, and when given everyone changes their mind about it every scene or so, it begins to add up a bit. This kind of intrigue needs to be far tighter to work, and in the end it just feels messy. It also, as I said, just doesn't seem interested in really looking at the meat of what it's looking at. The intrigue of the Reformation and the struggles of Catholics and Protestants alike, how people stood by their religion even to the point of death, and considering how all this came together in historical assessment, particularly that of the focus of the piece, Mary herself, it just feels ignored. It's a convenient plot, the Protestants being Protestants only because it puts them in opposition to Mary, who only exists as a character in the piece to fulfill the character function, and that's it. To be frank, the only reason you couldn't set this on an alien planet with a similar society is because otherwise it wouldn't fit in with Evelyn's plot. But otherwise, there's nothing that sets these people in their time and in the provenance of what's happening in that time. Mary, to be frankly, just seems like a generic queen type. There's no real attempt to analyse her rule for any frame, whether to decide whether there's a revisionist thing like saying she's better than her reputation, or worse than her reputation. We're left to guess because the story just doesn't even bother exploring it at all. This is kind of important when dealing with someone quite so controversial in history. This is a mistake the 60s historicals never made, and well, unfortunately kind of spoils this story's efforts. It's particularly galling because Big Finish themselves would later do this right in a pretty similar, the story of a pretty similar plot. The Council of Nicaea, a later story which features the Fifth Doctor Perry and Erimem, again involves a schism in Christianity and the resolution of that. But that focuses far more on that schism, and allows the interactions and the ideas to all be presented themselves, particularly in how they affect a major character of the piece in Erimem. It's how to do this kind of pure historical right, where this one just kind of doesn't get it right at all. There are positives though. Despite the journey not really working, I think the resolution is satisfying. In that all the setup threads, particularly with working out the mysteries of the time kerfuffle and Evelyn's ancestry, all works well in coming together in a logical way. It's a bit like Blink, in that the time loop there came together logically, and it's similar here. Everything works in leading us back to where we should be. And of course there's Evelyn's character, which is note perfect from moment one. No nonsense, witty and intelligent, but with a real sense of compassion and morality, the sense she cares about people. And this develops really well throughout the story. We're not told this, we see it. The contrast between the large religious struggle and the lives of the people caught up in it, and that Evelyn cares more about the latter, really gives us a sense of who she is as a person, and that her intervention based on compassion is what convinces the Doctor to save them and enhances this further. I like that, and I think it's a great introduction for the character as a result. Overall, though, I find this one a bit lackluster. Whatever it does right, it's accompanied by just a constant feeling of tedium and eye-rolling at the pedestrian plot turns and simplistic narrative. I don't think it's bad. Even if we discount the stuff that works, it never becomes annoying or embarrassing or anything shit like that Big Finish easily could achieve when they wanted to, and believing they did on many occasions. Join me again on April Fool's Day. But ultimately, I think it's just mostly 2 hours of white noise, which is a shame given everything. At least we hear the Doctor say he's a viewer of a popular Netflix show, though. Final score for the Marian conspiracy is 4 out of 10. I'd say it's slightly below Big Finish's average, but not actually bad. It does a great job of introducing the new companion, and there's a few bits here and there, but ultimately it falls short for me because it fails to grasp the concepts and just sort of plods along without catching the interest. I know I'm against the grain on this one, but it just doesn't do it for me. But there was plenty in the road ahead for Evelyn, and next time we look at Big Finish, it will be Jubilee, a story that influenced Doctor Who forever and one of Big Finish's greatest triumphs.